Hey there. If you've ever thought that the options available to tessellation folders are quite limited to, in this particular context with hexagons and triangles, alternating one hexagon and one triangle, well, expanded symmetries on hexagon and triangle tilings just blows that out of the water. So if you take the standard options, where you have closed hexagons, you have open hexagons, you have closed triangles, and you have open triangles like these, then there are only 8 ways to arrange them. There's open and closed hexagon as a binary choice, open or closed triangle as a binary choice, and then are those on the same or opposite sides. So those 3 binary choices get you 8 different patterns. But what I'm here to tell you is that those aren't the only options. As you can see here, I also chose a second hexagon. And that is a choice I can make freely from any of those 8 base patterns. So here I have open hexagon and closed triangle on the same side. And then I chose a closed hexagon to accompany it. I could have also chosen a closed hexagon on the other side, an open hexagon on the other side, and actually I have that choice of open hexagon on the other side deeper in my stack of patterns. And even if you just keep with the standard hexagons, that gets you up to 32 different options. So you now have 4 choices instead of 1 when it comes to the next hexagon out. But that's not the only option either. These hexagons in the outer positions are in positions of 3-fold rotational symmetry, which means we don't have to use only the standard hexagons. We can add in hybrid hexagon twists, like I talked about recently, and those we can orient in 2 different ways. So that's adding 2 more options. So now instead of 4 options, we have 6. And there's just so many possibilities. So going from 4 options for the outer hexagon to 6 takes us up to 8 times 6 is 48 different possible patterns. And that's not even counting variations in spacing. So let's go through a few of these and then fold one together. Here I have my star weave pattern, which interestingly is not the first one I figured out in this symmetry. It's just the simplest one to fold. Now I have open triangle stars. This is the first one I figured out before I even figured out it was a general thing. So once I had this idea, I was then able to create the rest of the tessellations in the stack once I realized it was a general characteristic. It took me 2 years to get there, from this tessellation to the rest of the stack. Then we have contained, where we have an open hexagon, closed triangle on the back, and then closed hexagon on the front. So very similar to our choices in star weave, just the triangle is on the back. We can keep going. We have wagon wheels, which I designed together with my Tessellations by Tile students. We've got those same open triangle stars, but this time with an open hexagon on the back instead of closed. We can keep going. There's, what if we put the closed hexagon in the front and the open hexagon outside? This is actually easier to fold than the other way around. There's roundabout, another easier option. Open hexagon with closed triangles around, then closed hexagon on the opposite side. And the great part about this is all of these options work. So here, just like Shrinking Violet, the pink one we saw earlier, we have a closed hexagon in the middle, open hexagons further out, but this time open triangles around. I call this one Rueda. Here's that one I've been alluding to, where I start with an open hexagon and closed triangles around it, then switch to an open hexagon on the other side. And what's different about this one is that this open hexagon is actually in a twofold rotationally symmetric position. So let's take a look at what's going on there. So when I have my third choice, my secondary hexagon here, I still keep all of the triangles the same. But then if I push the symmetry even further out, make that secondary hexagon into a twofold rotationally symmetric hexagon. So I've got the same thing on either side, but not 3 ways around or 6 ways around. Then I actually get a secondary triangle as well. So I've got this secondary triangle, closed triangle on the front, in addition to the closed triangles on the back. So this is the far island symmetry. The other one I call the islands symmetry because it creates these isolated outposts, which I think of as islands. So this symmetry gets us even further out, and we'll be working really similar to this one when we do our folding together. So this far island symmetry has some rules that come along with it. Specifically, the gap, the way that you move on the number line of twists from the central hexagon to the outer hexagon has to be the same way that you move from the central triangle to the outer triangle. Now, this might seem strange because I'm moving from open hexagon on one side to open hexagon on the other. That's a movement of, one would think, more than closed triangle on one side to closed triangle on the other. But the thing is, with hexagons, each shift along the number line lands you on a true hexagon. Whereas with the triangles, if you look back to my cursed triangles, my cursed twists stream from a couple weeks ago, then you can see that those triangles have 2 gap spaces in between. And so moving from open hexagon on one side to open hexagon on the other is the same distance and direction as moving from closed triangle on one side to closed triangle on the other. And that's what makes all of this work. This is something that blew my mind when I figured it out, and this tessellation convection here is the proof that this really does work, that these steps are consistent in these 2 different systems. Before I figured that out, I had been folding some of these tessellations, I just hadn't been sure why some were working and others were not. So here I have Field of Stars working on that same open triangle stars motif that I started this whole journey with. And here I'm transitioning from closed hexagon on one side to closed hexagon on the other. That's a shift of 1 smaller, 1 to the left. And my triangles also shift from open front to closed front, also 1 to the left. Here with crisscrossed, I have that same shift of 1 to the left, 1 smaller, and in this case it turns a closed triangle on the back into an open triangle on the back. So shifting from open front to closed front is the same as the shift from closed back to open back. Then I can take that even further and say closed front hexagon to closed back hexagon, similarly shifting 1 to the left, is shifting from open triangle on the back to double open triangle on the back, shifting more open on the back. So that's some context for what's going on here. Let's get out our paper. I've got a 32-fold triangle grid on a hexagon. Oh, and one last one before we move on. I had mentioned that you could throw in the hybrid hexagons, the 3-fold hybrid hexagons. You can also use 2-fold twists if you're using the far island symmetry. So here I used a mixed depth extended hexagon. And what I've got here is two different triangle twists. They both look like closed triangles, and they are both closed triangles on the back. What's different is that some of them are double depth. So effectively, since I didn't shift position on the number line by going from an open hexagon to a stretched open hexagon, I'm able to keep that closed twist in both of those triangle positions. I just am in the far island symmetry because my secondary hexagon is two-fold rotationally symmetric. So you can play with all of this in different ways and get varying results depending on what inputs you put in. So for our folding today, we'll be working on suction, one of the ones that I did not show you earlier, but it's kind of intermediate between several of them. And I didn't show it to you because it's currently hanging in my living room, and I really love this pattern. It's the one I'll be talking about on Instagram for the first half of the week. So we're going to start with a closed hexagon twist in the center of the creeper. And if you have questions, please drop them in the comments. I will have an eye on those. And hi, Sergio. And we'll go ahead and dive in. So this live stream, I should say, is an extension of the topics that I discussed in Advanced Twist Techniques on Saturday. And here we're getting more of a practical view of the those pieces of information, the extended symmetries and the equations that I just discussed. And we're going to see how this plays out as we fold. So I've got that closed hexagon set up. I'm going to poke my finger in the middle to make sure it stays as a hexagon and doesn't crumple. And I'm going to twist it around and down. If I have any doubt that my valleys are on grid lines, I can go in with my bone folder and smooth those out. So next up, we're going to start as if we're doing a what I call a closed triaxial weave, where we're going to have this starting alternation between the closed hexagon and closed triangle on the same side. So the first thing I'm going to do is figure out my spacing. I say first, we already have a twist in, but after the twist, I'm going to figure out my spacing, and I'm going to come 2 spaces out from the folded form of the hexagon. This is important. It's out from the folded form, not from where the pleat connects. Another way to reference this is to say, okay, I'm going to create a tube pleat, and so I need to have my valley. You can again think of this as 1 spacing out from the folded pleat, or 2 spacings out from the valley underneath. So I'm going to put a closed triangle twist at this grid intersection. My mountain is 1 spacing further out from the valley, and that's another reference that I can use. So I always use solid red lines for mountains, dashed blue lines for valleys. And I'm going to open the extension of the pleat past that point until I reach my point. I'm going to split my pleat coming out from the hexagon in 2 directions, evenly spaced apart, rotate that around and get my closed triangle twist. Then I'm going to squash that and move on to the next pleat, the one that's the bottom half of the tube. From there, I'm going to repeat the same move again. So I find my target grid intersection, either thinking 2 spacings out from the corner of the hexagon, or my valley 1 spacing over from this folded pleat, mountain 1 spacing further than that, and get my closed triangle twist. Now, I've got a pleat overlap here, and usually I would be saying, okay, let's go ahead and resolve that pleat overlap. But since the twist we're going to use to resolve it is on the opposite side of the paper, let's leave it be for the time being and come back to it in a minute. So I'm going to continue around in exactly the same way, putting in each of my closed triangle twists. The important thing here to keep in mind is that this closed hexagon is 6-fold rotationally symmetric. That means that once I pick the first triangle, the rest of the triangles are already determined. So I'm going to go around and make the same triangle on each of the pleats coming out of my central hexagon. And by the way, the recording for this will be available as soon as the live stream is done. And I do recommend folding from the recording more than folding from the live stream, just because of the speed that I'm going. And also, it can be confusing to do and learn at the same time. Okay, great. So I've got all 6 of my triangles in place. You'll notice on this last one that I have a pleat overlap on both sides of my twist. And from here, I'm going to flip the paper over. And again, since the center is 6-fold rotationally symmetric, it doesn't matter what orientation I choose to flip it in. I'm going to choose a pleat overlap. I'm going to pick this one semi-randomly. There's one that's an odd one out because it happened in the opposite order, and that's this one. It's going to be a little harder to deal with, so I'll deal with this one first. From here, my choice in this tessellation is to do an open hexagon. And so I've opened my pleat overlap, and what I'm looking for is this little tooth. And I've got one mountain coming in over the top of the tooth, one mountain coming in under the bottom. And what that tooth is going to allow me to find is the center of my open hexagon. So you want to be careful here and find the correct center. You don't want to be looking under here because the valley is coming straight into that. We want to have our center outlined by our 2 mountain folds and the valleys be on the outside of those mountains relative to the center. The other cue that we have here is that we get to create another tube pleat. So this is a tube because we've got the 2 spacings underneath, and with single depth pleats, our mountains exactly touch. And once we've got that situation showing us where our central hexagon is, we can go ahead and put in the remaining pleats around that open hexagon and flatten it and use our bone folder to get those folds nice and crisp. This hexagon is going to be threefold rotationally symmetric. So whatever happens on this side also happens on this side and this side. And then whatever happens on this side also happens on this side and this side. So we have different distances to reach our closed triangles on the other side in these two alternating edges of our threefold hexagon. And this is going to be important for what we do continuing on. So next up, we've got this extra reference that we learned from the last twist that we get a tube up here. So we're going to get the same tube over here because the center is sixfold rotationally symmetric. So whatever happened here is also going to happen here and here and here and here and here, and you get the idea. But when I do the tube this time, I'm running into a pleat overlap, and that's kind of a problem. So what I'm going to do is reorder this pleat overlap. Now this one wasn't a problem because this twist wasn't set up already, and that wasn't going to interfere with the twist itself. And this one's not going to interfere with the twist itself either. It's coming out one spacing away, but it is going to make it messy to do what we need to do next. So what I'm going to do is reorder this pleat overlap. I'm going to say, okay, my new pleat goes through first, my old pleat comes through second. But what I'm going to do after that is set up a triangle wrap. Now you'll see that mine just set up for me because I had basically not extended the valley in here past the valley of the initial pleat. So what we're doing is making a three-way intersection of valleys under there. And then the mountain of our new valley is in, so it makes this 120-degree intersection with our newest pleat of the new hexagon. And if you didn't catch that this time, there will be many more of these, so don't worry. You'll see more examples soon. Once we have that triangle wrap in place, we do have one more pleat overlap, but it's way out here, and we're not going to worry about that for this twist. So once we get everything down and in, again, this is a threefold rotationally symmetric position. I'm going to leave the triangle wrap as is until we flip back to the other side, just so we can have less flipping of the paper. So we're going to do the same exact thing again, where I want to create my tube pleat here to set up my next open hexagon. And in order to do that, I'm going to reverse the pleat ordering. I'm going to let the valley run through just enough to hit the existing valley of the twist we just made. And that's going to combine and veer off in another direction with a mountain on our side of the valley to tuck that into the triangle wrap. From there, I can open up the rest of my pleat overlaps and get the rest of my open hexagon in place. And you see now why I recommend watching first and then folding from the recording after. So I've got another open hexagon, and then for this one, I'm going to go ahead and set up the triangle wrap, reversing the pleat ordering before I even have the pleat fully in place. So I can just pop that in there, no problem, and keep moving to get the rest of my pleats for my open hexagon. And then we're going to do it again. Here again, I'm popping down my pleat that's crossing into the valley of my new pleat, which I know from the last 4 is forming a tube with this pleat out from the center. And then I can set up my remaining pleats for my open hexagon. And squash that into place. Last but not least, I have my 6th 3-fold hexagon, and I'm seeing 3-fold hexagon in the way that it interacts with the rest of the pattern, not that the hexagon itself is modified in any way, although you could stick a hybrid hexagon in these positions. And here I need to open up the pleat overlap down below, so you can see we've got this complex set of pleat overlaps. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 pleat overlaps in here. And what I want to do is open it up so I can get the innermost of these pleat overlaps open. And then I have choices. If I can see where the center of the open hexagon is, I can go ahead and set my next tooth of the hexagon to come down and make sure it stays underneath. We don't want it to come up above our point of the pleat from the previous twist. We want it to tuck under and then do that same wrap where the valleys are running into each other and causing a 3rd pleat to form. So kind of the opposite of setting up the triangle twist from 1 pleat. So from 1 pleat on the other side, we were doing, okay, let's split this pleat into 2 other pleats. Here we're combining 2 pleats into a single pleat. And then we have the same wrap up here that we've been doing. And we can get the remainder of the pleats in place at that point. So here we've got a wrap on both sides, and that's because there's 6 hexagon twists around, there's 6 triangle wraps between them, and we didn't do any wraps for the first twist, so that leaves 2 for the last one. Once we've got that in place, we can go ahead and squash. Then we'll flip over and resolve all of these triangle wraps into closed triangle twists. So it's a flap, it's currently laying down flat. I'm just going to take this mountain, put the valley on the far side, and squash that twist. And I'm going to make sure that I'm doing that for all of my triangle wraps, going around, making sure I get all 6 of them. And how do I know there's 6 of them? Well, there's 1 for each side, and there are 6 sides, so therefore there are 6 of these closed triangles. Okay, so if we've got all of these closed triangles, what's the next step? So currently we have no pleat overlaps. This means we're at a natural tiling break. And I'm going to go ahead and put my 6 facing me. And I'm going to stick a 3 in the middle of one of these hexagon holes. So when we have these twists, we've got some options. And the option that first appears is saying, okay, around this hexagon, I've got 2 triangles that touch the corner of the open hexagon. My third one is going to be right here. That seems like a good place to start, so let's do that. So if I set up, so the next thing I notice is that from the corner of the closed triangle to the center is 1 grid spacing. So my center is going to be 1 grid spacing out along this pleat that goes where I want the corner to be. The other cue that I have is that I need to maintain tube pleat spacing throughout. So I've got a tube here, I've got a tube here. This is just a property of this pattern. Okay, I've got my new triangle. It's setting up another twist, and specifically, I can see the way that these pleats are coming in. They're coming in at a 60-degree angle to each other. That means they're setting up a hexagon twist. And in this context, if we follow the 3, it's pointing towards that central 6-fold hexagon. So that is going to mean that I'm going to have a closed hexagon in this position on this side of the paper. And as I set that up, I notice that I've got a pleat overlap here really close to the hexagon. What I'm going to do is open that up so the mountains run together, because the triangle twist is going to be on this side. The mountains run together, and I'm going to let that lay down as a 3-way intersection temporarily while I squash my closed hexagon twist. Then I can open up my triangle and continue around in the same way. So much in the same way we did on the other side, each edge is going to be identical because of the 6-fold rotationally symmetric position in the center. So then coming to this side, I need my closed triangle. I need it to have a corner here and a center here. And so I'm going to set up that pleat. And squash. And you'll notice that I caused a pleat overlap under this triangle, but we're going to leave that be for right now. And this is more of a, this is something I'm doing because of this particular pattern than something I'm doing because of the tiling as a whole. Usually when I go around, I want to resolve these overlaps ASAP, but for this particular pattern, it's going to be easier to wait and deal with it on the other side of the paper. So again, setting up my closed hexagon, I run into what would be a pleat overlap right in here, close in, that I can turn into a 3-way intersection that I'll lay flat for now, so it's easier to get this twist folded into place. And I've got a little bit of funkiness going on, so I'll make sure all of my folds are on the grid lines before I finally iron it out and open my triangle. So there's options in the order of how you do things. If I had more grid to work with, I would definitely go and work on the other side, get that next open hexagon into place. Right now, it's not a super high priority, but I'll show you how I do that so you don't have to wait all the way till the end to see. So the next thing I'm going to do is set up the next triangle, which I know really well where it goes. It's 2 spacings out along this pleat. And I'm going to set it up as a 3-way intersection. And you'll notice that wow, that really looks like I'm setting up an open hexagon hole. And that's because that's precisely what I'm setting up. And I just need to find the boundaries of that hexagon, make sure that this bit, for example, doesn't stay up, it gets flattened out. And on this 32-fold triangle grid on a hexagon, I get half of my open hexagon twist. Then I can flip back over, resolve my closed triangle, and continue onwards to the next edge. So this is going to be the same exact thing again that we've already seen twice. So I'm going to set up my closed triangle. This is going to create pleat overlaps on both sides. If I had a lot more grid, then I would probably do the open hexagon on the back, setting this up and moving from there. But it really depends on the pattern and how close the twists are to each other sometimes, as to the precise order that everything gets folded. But that said, there is a lot of similarity in the order of folding for these patterns that share the basic symmetries underneath. So I've set up my triangle as a three-way intersection. I'll now open that up and squash, then set up my triangle on the opposite side of the hexagon, again as a three-way intersection for starters because this bit under here is not flat. Then flipping over, I'll make sure I have the spiky star outline and get that squashed into place, making sure those little flaps on the edges are where they're supposed to be. Flipping over, I'll open the triangle and squash, then repeat the whole process again. The great thing about tessellations, you don't have to learn a new step with each move around. You just repeat the same steps over and over again. So if that's something that you like doing, then tessellations are probably a good fit. Because I know that with, for example, advanced figurative stuff, you end up doing so the animals and bugs and all the crazy stuff that people are doing in the world of advanced origami. You end up having like 200 steps, and each one is different, and you have to figure out each one individually. But with tessellations, you can figure out one sequence of moves and then use that same sequence of moves over and over and over again. And really, these sequences of moves aren't just unique to individual patterns. They're copied over multiple patterns. So if you, for example, learn this tessellation, then it becomes a lot easier to work on some of the ones that I was showing earlier today. So close variations to this tessellation include this one, where we start with an open hexagon instead of closed, and then continue the symmetry further out by pulling a triangle to this side. Or you can do the triangles on the opposite side of the hexagons. You can have these same hexagons but in the opposite order. You can, really just go wild on your combinations, and you're using the same underlying structure to fold each of them. So from here, I just squashed a open partial hexagon. I'll flip over to the other side, continue around in that same direction I was moving in. And yes, Sergio mentioned in the chat that it looks simple in my hands. And that is slightly deceptive because I've been doing this for a while, and my brain works in these symmetries. And frankly, I've been teaching these for a while. So there's some ease that comes with repetition that won't necessarily be there your first time through. So, I mean, you can see, for me, folding and holding a conversation is possible. And it might not be possible for you at first. So building up the skills bit by bit, and all of a sudden you'll start to realize as you're folding your grids, you don't need to 100% focus on your grids anymore. And then when you're folding, say, something else, you realize you don't need to 100% focus. You can carry on a conversation. You can watch a lecture. One of my favorite things to do while folding is watch philosophy lectures. And those take a lot of attention, but sometimes for me it's more about catching whatever my brain is willing to grasp onto in the moment, and less about hearing absolutely everything that they have to say. And so that works out. So if I'm really wanting to focus on the origami, sometimes I can't even have music. So sometimes I do things that are so hard that even music is too distracting. So there's always a range of skill level and concentration required. So even for me, there are things that are hard. And frankly, even in the symmetry type, when you have the twists really close together and have these single width pleats instead of the tubes, then this is much more difficult to fold than suction here. So there's gradations in everything, and one of the reasons I chose this one is because you do have a lot of these references everywhere. So coming around to the last corner, I've got a pleat overlap that's kind of stuck in here under this triangle that I'm going to reorder. So this bit's sticking out. Then when I set up my next triangle twist, that will already be in place like we've seen in the other corners to fold my open hexagon. And from there, I can squash my triangle. So the key as you go around and around and around the symmetry of tessellation is that you will need 2 triangles for each hexagon that you put in. That's a property of the tiling, not just the symmetry. And then a property of the symmetry is that you will have different loops at different stages. So here I had a central loop with the 6-fold hexagon. Then my next loop only had 3-fold hexagons. This loop further out alternated between 6-fold and 3-fold. Then the loop after that will have 2 3-folds and a 6-fold on each edge. And so you'll never reach a loop again that has all 3 folds or all 6 folds. This makes it a little bit tricky to find the alignment that you want with the edge of the paper if you're doing a rotated grid. And what I would recommend is stick with the tiling alignment, and then you can get natural tiling breaks and nice borders outside of that. So let me see if I have an example of that specifically. Yes, here's two examples. So in this Shrinking Violets piece, I kept the alignment aligned to the 6 repetitions of 6-fold hexagons. And that meant I had to fold all the way to the edge so that I would get as much of the pattern as I wanted. Whereas in Wagon Wheels here, I stuck with the tiling alignment, and so I was able to have this border with respect to the edge, but my direct repetitions of the 6-fold hexagon do not line up with the edge. They actually kind of alternate. So I've got 1 6-fold, then 2 3-folds, then 1 6-fold again. So these are really the two main options for alignment. And if you want to learn more about alignment, then I've got my rotated grids videos that talk all about that. So that's all for today. And let's take a look at the front and back of this hexagon. Again, I call it suction because we've got these nice swirly structures around the open hexagons, and I find that highly visually pleasing. And you can see we're getting this central weavy structure starting up again out on the corners. So this is a fun one. It's a good first step into this symmetry on opposite sides. If you want a first step into this symmetry period, then star weave is the best introduction. And I do have a video on folding star weave. I think it's the one on reverse engineering without crease patterns. So there's lots and lots of options. If we stick with the simpler twists, then we've got 32 options in terms of, okay, open or closed hexagon center, open or closed triangle, open or is that triangle on the same or opposite side as the hexagon, and then the next hexagon out we have a choice of same or 1, 2, 3 different. If you start counting the hybrid twist, that goes up to 5, or a fifth option, 6th if you count the 2 different orientations of the hybrid hexagon. Then if we extend out to even further symmetries, we get additional options like using this open mixed depth hexagon as well. So there's just huge varieties of options available. And I mean, I haven't folded them all. And I hope that you will explore and see what you like best. All right, so that's all for today. Happy folding, everyone. And I will see you next week at the same time. So, peace and happy folding.